Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. Um, I'm Caitlin Barnard, part of our developer marketing team here at Kong, and I'm excited to welcome you to Tech Talks by Kong. I'm just going to cover a few housekeeping items before we get started. At the end of the presentation, we're going to open it up to Q&A and discussion. So please feel free to leverage that chat functionality at the bottom of your screen throughout. But if you do have any questions today for Jeremy, please use the Q&A button. That will just help us keep track of all the questions and make sure we don't miss anything. Otherwise, I'll be monitoring the chat throughout as well. The recording will be sent out within 24 hours, so you'll receive that via email. If for some reason you don't see that directly in your email, it will be available on YouTube as well. So I'm really excited for today's session. We have a great presentation for you today by one of our Kong champions, Jeremy Glassenberg, on API development and AI, what to expect next. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Jeremy, to get started.
Alrighty, thank you, Caitlin, and thank you all for joining. I see from chat already we have people from really all over the world and some more difficult time zones right now. So thank you all for those who are joining in random hours of the night as well here. So the name is Jeremy. I've been part of the Kong Champions program. And today we're basically going to be talking about API development and AI. I'm sure if you're here, you're already doing work in the API space, and you've probably dabbled in AI as well, just with everything going on. So what I'd like to do is get a little bit into just the navigation of the landscape of the AI landscape and its relationship with APIs, and not just how we navigate that, but understanding really where are the opportunities. And I would emphasize here the validated opportunities that we can look into if you are looking into either using your API expertise to get into the AI space, or looking into how to bring AI technologies to enhance your company's API experience. First, a little bit about myself. The gist you have to know is just I'm working on APIs for quite a bit. Basically, the last 16 years, I've been full time, primarily as a product manager in the API space. Naturally, working at various companies on APIs, most notably Box, Tradeshift, and most recently leading API governance at DocuSign. But naturally, if you're working with various startups in different industries on APIs, you're going to get pulled into AI. For me, that happened about 10 years ago. I've already gotten involved in AI, I don't know, I'd say back in the early 2000s, definitely before AI was cool, studying neural networks back at the time. But about a decade ago, I started working with an AI-focused VC fund. And so I started supporting many startups in their portfolio and understanding as these were AI-focused companies, and I was helping them to figure out their API strategy. But from that, I could see the trends and also the hype that could happen in the AI space. So I got to go through one cycle in the past of seeing AI being the craze and not too much coming of it. And from all of that experience, also inherently by working at startups that have been successful and unsuccessful, I've learned to maintain, in general, a sense of skepticism and really just having a good filter for where there's going to be value and where there's hot air. When it comes to AI, I can say this time around, there's definitely value. I do still see a lot of hot air. Bootstrap Labs, the VC fund I primarily worked with, they highlighted over years that over 80% of the companies that pitch AI to them don't actually have AI. Now we legitimately have AI, but sometimes we don't have a real use case for AI. This is still better than what I've seen in other industries. When you work in APIs, you will get pulled into AI, of course, but I've also, a few years back, been pulled into crypto, where everything I saw was basically hot air. Here, I definitely see a lot of hype, but there's definitely market validation for the technology now. We just need to apply some filtering. And that's why today I want to highlight, well, you've probably heard a lot about AI and have been wondering, where does AI fit in the API space? I will emphasize that while there are places where AI certainly can provide value in the API space, we have to have that filter. I don't want us to just say, where can we jam AI somewhere? Let's figure out where there actually is going to be value. So, how am I going to structure the rest of the talk today? I'm first just going to give you a little bit of a lay of the land, have a way of segmenting the market so we can organize and evaluate in different places where opportunities may lie between the API industry and the AI industry. Within those segments, I'll highlight functional gaps where AI may be a fit, and hence where there may be some near-term opportunities against validated practical near-term opportunities, while right at the end taking a few minutes to talk about some more long-term vision, more high in the clouds opportunities just a bit for the end. I really want to keep a focus on what's trending and where is there really validated opportunity. So I'll start by showing some obvious opportunities. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here on much of it. And then from here, we'll get into really what is the landscape? How are we going to organize the market to dive in deeper? Some obvious things we're seeing here, one, when it comes to AI technology, the popular AI models, ChatGPT, Anthropic, Gemini, across the board, they all need APIs. We've seen that every single one of these companies is invested in having a solid developer experience. So naturally, where there is no AI technology, we're going to want to have APIs. Also, where we're seeing integrations in general between APIs outside of the AI industry, just connector tools, low code, no code. Anyone who's been working with any of these tools the last couple of years can see how AI quite obviously came into place. It's hard to integrate things no matter what we do with connectivity tools, they make it easier. But yeah, it's just naturally easier to let some program go and build a connector if they know how the APIs work. So yeah, there's an obvious use case there for integrations. Let's get into other scenarios that for anyone who's been working with Kong, attending other webinars, probably also knows of these opportunities. But we'll get into the next L2, still pretty obvious opportunities for AI. Before I get into what may be a little bit more gray, where there's theoretical opportunity and filter out what's actually practical in there. Um, but Kong has shown that we can take the learnings, the resources, the technologies for API management and apply them to AI. It's not just about having APIs for AI, but taking what we've learned in our API gateway and managing routing, managing filtering, rate limiting, security, monitoring, taking all of that and applying it to AI itself, hence Kong's AI Gateway, which Kong has plenty webinars about. I'll get into the AI Gateway just a little bit today, but I want to talk about some other opportunities. And then there's the whole just how do we take the AI technology and how they're making experiences easier and apply that to API design, API development, going beyond the integrations with APIs and actual management of APIs. This one I want to put a question mark around because while there are opportunities, we are confident there are opportunities. What I've also commonly hear when working between companies and helping other teams launch their APIs, they always ask, "Ooh, how can we bring AI into it?" Without actually asking instead, what are the pain points that we're dealing with where AI might actually come into play? So again, rather than jamming AI into products, let's go with the product solution route. But we do have confidence that there's something there and actually just taking AI technology and bringing it into API management, not just integrations. Okay, so with that in our minds, let's organize what we've seen to work into a manageable landscape. And so what we're basically seeing is one, the opportunity for AI to basically have AI tools that support API management, two, have APIs to support AI tools, and three, take the learnings and resources in the API space, like the API gateway and other API tools, and actually make AI equivalent tools and infrastructure to support the management of AI technology. To completely misquote JFK, ask not what AI can do for your APIs, but what APIs can do for your AI, or vice versa, or both. We are going to talk a little bit about both. I'm especially going to talk today about where we can have API infrastructure to support AI. And then also, if you're building out an API, if you're managing an API, or you're providing your own API tools, where does AI fit in? Interestingly, if we look at those two cases, API infrastructure for AI and AI tools for APIs, I've seen looking at the API gateways out there is very interesting dichotomy in the strategy that API gateways are taking as they compete and incorporate in AI. Kong really focused on going the AI gateway route, taking what they've done for API tooling and supporting AI. Other API gateways are instead more focused on the take AI tools and just bring it in to support API development and API management. It seems like a very odd kind of land grab, but what I'm basically seeing here is it's just a matter of with all the opportunity out there, you have to prioritize near term. And some companies have decided to focus on supporting AI. Other companies have instead asked the question, let's bring AI functionality in to support our features. Over time, we're going to see more of a collision course here, but it's been interesting to watch. Um, and especially in Kong's case, though, with the magic of plugins and flexibility, there's always the opportunity of supporting both the Kong AI gateway and the Kong API gateway. And so we're going to see that as well over the next few minutes as I talk about, regardless of which gateway you use. Yes, Kong is my favorite. Um, what are the opportunities if you're, say, building plugins for these API gateways and finding a way to support both the AI industry and the API industry? So I'm going to first, among these two areas, talk about bringing AI into our API strategy. Uh, Reiterating this slide is really just for people who want to take screenshots. Yes, we've already seen it. If you've worked with any low code, no code connectors, it's quite clear that there's an AI opportunity. I had actually, when it came to say AppSheet, built a whole application, took me weeks to set up that integrated various tools within Google Workspace. And then I discovered when Gemini came out that you could just ask Gemini to basically build a similar app for you. So yeah, if AI knows all of our API schemas and how to connect, great. They can take a lot of our coding efforts away to make it even easier to connect. Okay, we've gotten that out of the way. Let's go beyond integrating APIs and focus on what do we do when we are managing our APIs? How do we make our APIs easier to manage? How do we make our APIs higher quality? And so to do so, I want to first look at the state of API management tooling today, which in recent years has already demonstrated higher value in automated tooling to simplify API management. This has been going on for years, especially by being built around the Open API schema. Once our industry adopted some sort of schema for JSON-based REST APIs, it became easier and easier to automate documentation generation, library generation, API monitoring, and even API design. And all these new automated tools didn't really need APIs. In fact, arguably, it's easier to build tools around APIs than something with UI around it. And when it comes to activity monitoring, it's pretty straightforward to see what's happening in the API space, in APIs. When it comes to API testing, it's more straightforward to make an API call and just see the output. So it was kind of straightforward to start building solutions to better manage our APIs without having to actually apply AI. Now, if we look at the tools today, I do still see on the job many gaps and opportunities to better automate API management and do so without actually having to jam in AI. But then there are also places where AI can work. So this is where I emphasize that we need to treat this like a product problem and understand actual challenges that we're encountering, and then evaluate the best solutions. We can evaluate solutions for the problems we've identified, knowing that API is one option, but only one option. I don't want to jam AI in there just because it's cool. It often can lead to good ideas, but not necessarily solutions to actual problems. And that's why we have a lot of hot air in the AI space in the first place. So basically, let's treat this as a product management problem. And like all product management problems, we want to structure our approach. So there are the tools that we've seen today to better assist various areas of API management. Let's organize that according to really the API product lifecycle. For today, we really just need to focus on it. Its simplicity is the steps to planning and designing your API, the steps to actually building your API, and then launching and maintaining your API afterwards. And then also, let's not forget the general developer experience beyond the API, like providing good documentation and good guides for developers. All right, and if we look at each of these steps, we'll see how there's currently some pretty good functionality, but also functional gaps and thus more opportunity to improve the API experience. Let's first take a look at the design step. There are tools out there to help you actually write your open API schema. Um, Editor tools like Kong's Insomnia, and there are actually plugins you can build on top of that. I once just hacked together, understanding that, with the way RESTful APIs work, there tends to be a lot of repetitive content in Open API. Quite simply because most of our models are just going to have CRUD operations: get request, post request, put request, delete request, the same operations on top of every model. So I wrote a simple script whereby you can take an open API schema and based just on the models, generate the rest of the schema, generate the functions, the API, the API endpoints for the schema. This is something I mean to create as a plugin for Insomnia. I think there are other API gateways. I think Axway built something like this as well, where you first define your model, and it'll just generate the endpoints for you, assuming you're being RESTful. Um, but we can still see when it comes to API design then, while there are new tools to help to automate and help to provide guidance in generating your API designs, yeah, there are limits here. For instance, we've been encouraging API designers to utilize industry standards that are APIs are more consistent in design across companies, namely using something like schema.org, so that we can even auto-suggest, reuse API models and endpoints rather than having to reinvent the wheel and having disjoint APIs. It's there, but can we do better to really help with API design? And this is where I'm starting to see, tools to actually design the schema for you from a prompt rather than just auto suggest a model or an endpoint here or there. Say, what are the use cases for your APIs? And, we'll go and generate it for you. And maybe what they're doing there is actually taking in industry standard APIs from schema.org and other sources so that, yeah, it's easier to plan out an API with AI, taking your recommendations, but also looking at schema.org for you. In practice, I haven't seen too many people choosing to go to schema.org when they have the opportunity to actually just reuse existing APIs. AI naturally provides a better experience to kind of guide you that way. Let's look at some more use cases and say, does API make sense or not? When it comes to, say, auto-suggest, especially auto-suggest for API design comes up for API governance often. When I've helped larger companies establish internally API standards, I've done so by bringing in tools to make it generally easier to plan APIs, but direct teams to stick to a standard and have API consistency. One method: have a set of reusable models that you can reference in your API design and then automatically suggest existing models so that teams don't go and build a completely different model for a very similar purpose. And in doing so, make it difficult for developers then interact with APIs that should work better together but have a different underlying model. This is the dream, but in practice, I've only seen it work so well of having this sort of an auto suggest. So I've learned to do to actually better enforce API governance is in the CI/CD pipeline, actually track when an API update is including a new API model. And we check to say, well, if this is a new model, is it similar to a model that we already have? In which case, I can go back to that team and recommend that they reuse an existing model that maybe they didn't pick up in that auto suggest feature. Now, this is something that has to be done fairly manually. We can auto detect when there's a new model, but I was wondering, can we auto detect when this new model is suspiciously similar to another model that we have? And does this require AI? I would say not necessarily, actually. 20 years ago, when I was in college, yeah, I am that old. I wrote some code that just did some string comparison between variable names to identify with some accuracy a mapping. That at least doesn't take Gen AI. It doesn't take ML even. Arguably, there was some AI component to it, but nothing too advanced to spot these patterns. And in doing so, we could identify when a new model that has been proposed to an API update could, in fact, be instead replaced with an existing model for better reuse. So, this is where we can improve automation, maybe have a little bit of AI, but we don't necessarily need to jam it in there. When it comes to, though, server side code stubs, I'm very curious, by the way. I'm going to do a casual poll here. If anyone has actually tried using a server-side code stub, can you just post in chat, A, whether you've tried a server-side code stub, and B, whether you actually adopted it in the end? To clarify what I'm talking about here, it's very common to take an open API schema and then auto-generate client-side code for developers to call your APIs, like code in Node or PHP or Python for developers who are calling your APIs. Server-side code stubs are about auto-generating from your schema code that you're going to use in your own servers to actually run your APIs. I'm curious if any of you, feel free to post in chat, if any of you have ever actually even tried one of these. What I've seen across the many places I've worked are companies getting interested, trying them, running the code generator to get their code stubs, and just not being able to actually use these at all. Because the server-side code stubs, they're based strictly on your external API design. When it's just not getting enough information about how your backend works, how your database works, how your infrastructure is set up, if you have a domain layer, how that's there. So there's just not enough for this server-side code stub to really help you out. Years ago, I had hypothesized, can we take some sort of, say, string comparison tool to map the API schema to your database schema and figure out the queries that might make sense to your backend to actually generate, to actually run the APIs that you need. That might work. We would probably, though, knowing the improvements in infrastructure today, distributed systems, especially when we have a domain layer, there's more that we need to understand. So this is where there's an opportunity for Gen AI to come in. If it knows enough about not only your schema, but about your backend to potentially give you a better head start in implementing code. And I have seen some API gateways attempt this. I do see an opportunity in creating plugins instead. While Kong goes and focuses on the AI gateway, they've created that open system for new AI tools to come in as plugins. This I see as a good opportunity if anyone can figure out, especially utilizing Kong not just operating at an L7, but working deeper at the service mesh layer. You may have more knowledge then in your system of the infrastructure to potentially develop something better here. And so as we get deeper into infrastructure as well, we can also look at the API maintenance topics, improving the API release processes, going into CI/CD pipelines. An example of a simple automated solution for a common problem I've seen when it came especially to API governance, not just about API governance. In general, when it came to having a solid quality API, we always want to maintain backwards compatibility. And I want to watch for cases where a team accidentally made an update to an API, not knowing that it was going to be a breaking change. This is actually a very straightforward problem to solve in API world. There are a few solutions out there, my favorite being just the OpenAPI diff. And what this does is, rather than rely upon functional tests of, when you're ready to release an API, make a bunch of API calls automatically and see if there are any changes in the output. Well, assuming your OpenAPI schema is accurate, we could actually just look at the schema, run a diff, and say, hey, is there a change in, required parameters? Is there a change in the output structure? Warning, that's a breaking change. So at very low cost, we can actually catch issues here. And also, without AI, this is a very straightforward algorithm that solves this particular problem. That said, there are other challenges and opportunities when it comes to improving the API release process itself, tools that we can get into the CI/CD pipeline. And so I'm leaving this as really an open question. I've applied linters as well, and I just have to ask, is there anything else we can do for the pipeline? I am curious what people want to post in chat about that if you've seen experience in this. Again, what I highlight here is for every problem, let's identify the problem, find a solution and say, do we need AI or not for this? Maybe not for breaking change detection, but maybe for something else when it comes to the CI/CD pipeline. When it comes to API monitoring, this is where I've seen a more functional gap against the automated tools that we have today. For instance, when it comes to, say, rate limiting or other kinds of monitoring for security issues, let's say you have an app store and you want to run a series of checks before you let an app get in the marketplace. More often than not, things like rate limiting, they are necessary, but they're just not perfect. And I've sometimes jokingly compared it to the TSA, where maybe they're causing a lot of hassle, but they're not actually catching issues. In defense of the TSA as well, they do cause hassles, but they do also catch issues, or at least um, they do serve as a legitimate barrier. But when it comes to rate limiting, we've always encountered cases where a legitimate app gets restricted by the rate limit, and we look at what they're trying to do. It makes sense for them to do what they're doing, and we have to make some sort of an exception for them manually. Well, all the while, malicious apps may figure out what we're checking for and then just work around those. So, this is where we understand that API monitoring needs to be done more intelligently. So, for instance, I've learned to have checks for both the app submission process. If we have a marketplace, we run a few checks for security before an app gets approved for launch, but then have ongoing monitoring beyond just rate limiting to check for, say, patterns in what apps are doing. Perhaps it's not a malicious app. It's not an app that's violating our rate limits, but it's an app that's just doing something very inefficient with our API, making 3 or 4 API calls where it could be done in one call. That's being a burden on our servers, in addition, actually, to being a poor experience for the partner interacting with our APIs. And I've actually, at other companies, seen common patterns where developers make the same mistakes in how they're calling our APIs. What do I do then? Well, we have a smart monitoring system by which we check for those known patterns in what developers may do wrong and identify if a developer may be doing that and then give out a warning to our developer support team to go and contact the developer. Smart monitoring, as in we have looked at the data manually, identified patterns manually, and then hard coded the checks that we want to monitor for what could be suspicious activity or what could be, in our case, just a common issue of developers, not making API calls the way they should. Hmm. Pattern identification, this sounds like something that we can monitor more intelligently by having a monitoring system that not just relies on industry known information to look for suspicious activity when it comes to, say, API security, but instead look at our own activity, identify patterns in what developers are doing, and automatically then provide recommendations, identifications for where developers might be making mistakes. And hey, in addition to actually warning, um, developer support, if we can see that the pattern recognition is getting good and we can see the system is reliable, we can give it more of an authority to, say, block applications if it can say with high confidence that it caught an issue that we didn't otherwise spot ourselves. Or heck, go and automatically send a notification to a developer with a custom recommendation for how they can better improve their API integration. So yeah, when it comes to API monitoring, we could see how there is room for better automation and naturally room for AI here. I also like to look at an area that just didn't have enough tooling for many years, and I've been hoping to see better when it comes to what we call developer relationship management. This is basically providing those tools for developer advocates and developer support to, on one hand, maybe interact more in Stack Overflow and GitHub issues, and forums and emails. Obvious opportunity there. There are plenty of AI chatbots. So we can, have something that, gathers all the data from Stack Overflow and, can provide an automated reply as well. Okay, chatbots are no brainer. Let's look at another challenge I've seen in developer relations world. The overall experience, the overall developer funnel of bringing in a developer, onboarding a customer or partner who's going to work with your APIs and getting them from signing up to actually building, completing, and launching an integration. there's a lot of drop off, and it's very difficult to see where developers drop off and also when they're dropping off. In the past, I've had developer relations teams have spreadsheets. They're just watching which developer is signed up and then check every week or so, is there API activity? Are they seemingly, making less API calls and maybe getting frustrated? Are they struggling somewhere? But it requires a lot of developer relations engagement, actively looking at data to have that proactive relationship. We're trying to watch what are developers doing. Are they getting frustrated? Knowing that if they do get frustrated, some of them may reach out to us with questions, others might just move on. So this is where we have to be proactive. And it's an area where there's a lot of data where we're looking at manually and a lot of pattern recognition that we're also doing manually. That is an opportunity for better automation and potentially AI as well. I see some people posting in chats some tools they're seeing, maybe from hackathons and maybe from other plugins. That's great to see. I do know of things that have been launched, tested, products in development. So if you know of anything, it's great if you can post those in the chat as well. I want to go through the last bit of this quickly so we can also get into category 2 of what is happening with the API infrastructure and how that is helping the AI industry besides what AI can do for APIs. But of course, I want to also highlight finally on the tail end of the API lifecycle, API security. Again, this is kind of a no-brainer. Already, the API security companies are pulling in a lot of data to figure out patterns, say, how do we better identify problems in malicious API calls? We know that they're, one, looking for undocumented APIs because we know that so many data breaches that have happened today. I think the majority of data breaches are now happening at the API layer, the majority of which are happening just from unlisted APIs. So there's a lot of effort to just track those down, looking at the network activity. But there's also, there've also been high profile security breaches from known APIs, either that didn't have proper scopes, that had, say, personally identified information, PII, sensitive information that shouldn't have been in the output. These are things that we can detect automatically and likely without AI. Like you can probably go and scan the strings of outputs in APIs and say, this looks like PII. Maybe there's some AI, but AI from 10 years back, that's not the more expensive Gen AI kind of work. But I think there's more we can do here besides checking, is there sensitive content in the Open API schema? I like to look at the actual flows of API calls and say, is there some sort of a functional gap that we missed in the design? It's kind of how the Cambridge Analytica scandal happened, where they basically realized with the way the Friends API worked for Meta, there's an opportunity to take advantage of it. It didn't look like there was PII, and it looked like people were sharing their information voluntarily. But then we could see how that information was actually being exposed involuntarily by the nature of how the API was being called. And that takes a more intelligent assessment of looking step by step at how the API works to say, whoa, we should not be doing that in our APIs. So security, no brainer. We're already seeing some AI in here, a lot of pattern recognition. This is a large space. This is arguably a saturated space, but I do still think there are some interesting gaps and we can get smarter about the way we're actually looking at API security issues as well. So keep a lookout for more there. Okay, I can go on plenty more when it comes to opportunities to better improve automation on the API product lifecycle. There will be room for more questions, room for people to share what they've seen in tools and plugins. I want to take a few minutes still to talk about what APIs can do for AI. And let's talk about the AI gateway. Kong has really invested deeply. I saw them as the first diving into becoming an AI gateway when other API gateways may have been focused more on just bringing AI functionality in to support APIs. And it was maybe a risky bet, but I can say from what I've seen in the market, there is definitely a valid use case for what Kong is doing. I've even seen some controversy of should we be doing what we're doing at the L7 gateway layer? Well, let's go and validate what's going on in the market. My favorite form of customer validation, by the way, is when we see a customer responding to the lack of a feature by just hacking a solution or just building out their own solution themselves internally because they need it, which is exactly what Uber did. Got some friends over on the Uber infrastructure team. They have a great blog article about what they did. They unfortunately don't get to work with Kong, I guess. So what they had to do is build their own AI gateway as their teams were working with multiple different AI models. They saw immediately the need for having one layer so you can implement prompts and code that doesn't have to be custom to the APIs of Anthropic or of OpenAPI. Instead, have something in the middle that can decorate the instructions and manage then the interactions so you can abstract the differences between these models and just easily, when you need to, work with Anthropic, work with OpenAPI, or others. They also realize the need to check for PII, watch out for input attacks, apply monitoring, and cover some of the basics. Things that, by the way, yeah, the Kong Gateway I'm seeing and providing more. And then also through plugins, being able to do more than what you would do if you built your own AI gateway in desperation because you needed something when nothing else was out there. So we can see companies are definitely going that route. As long as they're using more than one AI model, and as long as they're seeing the challenges of having to monitor your AI solutions. There's another topic we can get into when it comes to AI security. I can say from having conducted some research for key AI companies, one thing I was warning them about is if you actually look at the underlying models for, actually, I shouldn't say the underlying models, but if you just go straight to working with ChatGPT and their built-in content filtering, they're very good at providing a simple experience for filtering inappropriate content, making sure that images are not inaccurate or not images just shouldn't go in there. Text doesn't have curse words or something offensive. Great. But for B2B solutions, where you are dealing with personally identified information, social security numbers, maybe medical information, things that are highly personal that should not be used for training data, data that is highly custom perhaps to your company, these models themselves don't have much just out of the box. You have to go to third-party solutions to really come to a custom solution for content filtering. And if you're working with many different models, it's going to be hard to implement your own content filtering for every single model. So it kind of comes nice to centralize that at a gateway. So Kong, I really think, has gone the right route, but we can also see that there's a lot you have to do here, especially for enterprise adoption. These content filters are going to require a lot of customization. They're going to be unique needs to different enterprises. And so there's going to be a lot of work to do once you have this layer to handle, say, say, content decorations. And just like how we have open API decorators and many plugins for the API gateways to tweak, decorate APIs like, hey, my API endpoint generator or description additions to OpenAPI. Well, likewise, there's decorations for inputs into the AI space and prompting. And then relatedly, when it comes to security and monitoring, Kong invested, every API gateway solution invests in their own API monitoring, but they also enable other API monitoring companies, API analytics companies, API security companies to plug in. And you may, if you've worked on APIs, see some overlap in what you need to check for, but certainly an opportunity here to take what we've learned, the resources that we've had when it comes to rate limiting and API monitoring, and applying it to AI as well. Hence, naturally, the AI gateway does work very well, and there's a lot of opportunity for those who've built plugins on the API side of things, looking at what's going on the AI side of things to make things specially work for the AI solutions, especially when it comes to monitoring, watching out for poison attacks and input attacks, and handling those, I think, with custom filtering. Okay, we're going a little bit over time, so I'm just going to take like a minute or two here to talk more about long-term vision. Again, for everything we've talked about today, I made sure that we have had validated scenarios of problems that we've tried to solve with solutions with existing technologies, and we realize that there's just opportunity to build out more. Where else can this go beyond making, say, API management better, beyond better securing AI, making AI management better? And I'm going to get more into the hypothetical here that may be a few years out. First bit, When it comes, the first bit I would say is just API neutrality. This is a years old hypothesis that as we better automate design, development, and management of APIs, the debate of, do we want to build a REST API? Do we want to provide a GraphQL API? Do we need gRPCs? May become irrelevant. If it's easier to build, design, manage all of this, then it should be easier to have a system that provides REST and GraphQL for the same functionality if it makes sense to do so. And I do think that if we bring in AI to better automate the design of APIs, the extent that you can say, this is what I need the API to do, we can generate for you a REST and GraphQL and gRPC option. We can generate the server-side code stubs for you, the ones that are actually usable. We can, provide better recommendations for your infrastructure. Naturally, this may just become less and less of an issue. And so we may more likely just provide all options and not see these as competing options over time. And let's go a little bit crazier and say, well, what happens if we are using AI to design our APIs and then also using AI to manage the connectors between APIs? That we've already been seeing a lot of, again, with low code, no code. Do we then need to specially design our APIs to be so human readable for developers to build these integrations? Or can we, as we gather more and more data from the integrations coming in, the AI implemented integrations as well, find ways of creating more efficient APIs that, we don't need a developer to see, we just need an AI connectivity tool to understand. This may actually lead to not even requiring REST or GraphQL and actually provide something else entirely that's maybe even more gRPC like, that's just meant for AI connectors to know how your API works and just work with that. So I do get very curious as to where this is going to go a few years in time if we're really training connectors and API design tools, if they're AI based, to continue to look at patterns and iterate themselves and go beyond what we're actually applying for API design strategies today. Once you get to that point, yeah, that is how APIs plus AI can lead to a great future of every possible, technology apocalyptic scenario that we've seen in movies. Just kidding. But what I do want to just bring this all together in the end, I will say, as someone who is skeptical, and we should be skeptical about AI, something is going on here. And there is an opportunity to both improve API management with AI and use what we know about APIs to improve AI. What we have to do is look at the scenarios, find validated cases of feature gaps, and then fill in those gaps. When we do fill in those gaps, we can start with non-AI tools, but as we gather data and patterns, that's where we can build better AI functionality into all of this. All right, I hope this has been interesting for all of you. Thank you all for your time. Thank you all for putting up with me for 45 minutes. And I will take a look at any of the questions, anything in chat we have pertaining either to API tooling for AI or bring AI into APIs. I don't see too many questions right now, but I can take a look at the chat. Caitlin, should we just see what's coming in chat?
Yeah, feel free to catch up on the chat. Lots of comments kind of throughout. And then, yeah, just a reminder to folks, there's a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So if you have any questions for Jeremy, drop them in there.
All
And I
right.
will just make one plug here while we wait for folks with any questions. But I saw a lot of people actually, as you were speaking, who were kind of building their own tools as well. And we have our yearly conference coming up, API Summit, here in September. Alongside that, we are running a hackathon. So we are accepting tools. They don't have to actually be created within the hackathon time timing. So if you've already created something and want to submit, I'm going to drop the link in the chat. So would love to see anything like that you've already built.
Yeah, Caitlin, I do see you posted a link to Kong Hackathon, and I do hope that we saw some new plugins coming out of that. Some I hope we have screenshots as part of the recording. People can see the chat because a few folk have posted some interesting experiences. So let's see, Sashin has posted, I developed an automation tool that generates Kong config code from OpenAPI specifications. That is awesome. I always thought that we can, better incorporate OpenAPI into the gateway itself and in API configurations. Emna notes. I think this relates to server-side code stubs. Try doing this with Scala, but I'm using a mustache as a template file to customize the generated code. Yeah, so I mean, most of the server-side code stubs are actually built, I find, through the same frameworks that are used to generate client-side libraries. And if you look at something like OpenAPI CodeGen, that what they're actually doing is they basically have mustaches to like map OpenAPI to a specific language. So you can have a PHP mustache. And they say, okay, based on what's in the schema, this is the code that we're going to generate for the PHP client-side code. So the server-side code stubs are usually doing something like that. Um, I'm curious, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, because I would find if you want them to be usable for server-side code stubs, you probably have to really tweak the mustache to better serve your own internal needs. Let me see what else other people have posted in here. All right, someone, I forget when this came up, but Kartika noted using OpenAPI generator to create a Quarkus-based server. So it looks like there have been some attempts to generate backend code, backend infrastructure off of an OpenAPI schema. I've seen them not work out very well, or at least need a lot of manual work afterwards. But it does sound like there's some ongoing attempts to get things going there. All right, what else do we have here? So Kartigas, can you elaborate more on how we can use AI in API security? So when it comes to API security, I think I went through that one a little quickly just because you can read up a lot on what's going on with API security and AI. The API security plugins are probably the most valuable plugins. Outside of API gateways, I'd say API security are where you're seeing VC rounds where companies are valued at $1 billion plus. And this is because, as APIs have gotten popular, we've also seen the consequences of not investing enough in API security. Many security experts I know just are so used to other areas of infrastructure, but they aren't used to APIs being popular, and they always had APIs as an afterthought. And now, as APIs have gotten popular, what are we seeing? We're seeing a massive percentage of data breaches happening at the API layer. And the reason behind it is actually concerning as well. The number one reason has actually been that we're just not really tracking our own APIs. We have many APIs that were not meant for external use that were unpublished. So a big chunk of API security has just been about finding those untracked APIs. That's mostly by looking at network activity. But there are other opportunities. It's not the only way that data breaches are happening through APIs is through undocumented APIs. The other has been public APIs that were not designed well. And I've had ways of identifying issues there, like lack of scopes and permissions, or I can tell that the output of an API has actually revealing information that should not be made available via that API. It may be too easy to obtain admin functionality or for an admin to obtain more information than they should. And so this is where we're seeing much more opportunity for general API security enhancements. Again, maybe AI, maybe not. One can scan an open API schema and spot some obvious cases of PII being revealed, but we can make it smarter to better catch when PII is unintentionally being exposed in an API, from making calls to the API, looking at the data and saying, hey, there's something else here. There's circumstances through different calls that we weren't able to find initially because maybe our functional test didn't perform the right set of steps that can trigger an issue in API where PII is released. That's where intelligent monitoring starts to come along. Let's see, what else do we have here? Some more questions are coming in on chat, I see. AI is being used effectively for bot detection and stateful attacks. Definitely. And this is where we are going to see some AI bots that are going to be watching specific API activity as well. Let's see. Most of the cases we had to use custom mustache files is to generate server stubs. I can understand that. If we're coming back to server-side code generation, from my experience, the client-side mustaches as well to generate client-side libraries tend to need some customization as well. This is why there's now like a whole industry forming around SDK generation. There are the open source SDK generators, but also API-matic and Seamless, and these other solutions coming out that our companies are basically about offshoring, outsourcing your SDK development, understanding that there often are these custom issues that you have to do for client-side SDKs as well. But yeah, if you're trying to do server-side code stubs, there definitely needs to be some work there. And this is where I want to take at least my own tech to just do string comparisons off the database schema and have the code stubs be somewhat custom to some other stuff in our backend. Let's see. Could we have a closed caption version of? I'll defer to Caitlin about that. I think someone has just a question around the recordings. Oh, sure did it. Okay. A couple other questions around the recordings. All right. I think I've answered everything that's popped up in chat, but I'm not sure I may have missed something here or there. If anyone has any final questions, we have a few more minutes. Feel free to post either in Q&A or just post in chat. We're checking out both. All right. Well, I will otherwise just say keep a lookout. In the recording, you may also see I've posted links to certain things, to certain tools, not just the AI gateway from Kong, but also Uber's article. So you can see what were the challenges they encountered when they tried to actually build their own AI gateway internally. It provides great insight into what you need for an AI gateway. We can see how Kong is more robust, but also how there's an opportunity then to build more plugins. So I would take a look at the links that are in the presentation on various articles and insights for the AI gateway, as well as other opportunities for API gateway plugins.
Awesome. Thank you much. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And thank you everyone who joined us today. I mentioned it in the chat, but just a reminder that the recording will be sent out within 24 hours. We'll include all of the links as well. So you should receive that. It'll also be available on YouTube if for any reason you don't see the email. So thank you all for joining us. We hope to see you in the future at another Tech Talk. And in the meantime, you can join us on our community Slack as well if you have any further questions. So have a great rest of your day, everyone.